Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. You know what? It doesn't really matter. Whatever time of day you're listening to this, it's always a good time of the day for yet another Sidcast. So here's the Sidcast for the Age of Absolutism. And we have the Divine Right of Kings and the End of Feudalism. So, boys and girls, we're officially entering Historical Period 2. Congratulations, you've made it this far. Historical Period 2 is the era of 1648 to 1815. And if you think about those bookend dates, 1648, Peace of Westphalia, 1815 is the end of the Napoleonic era in the French Revolution. So it's important to note a trend that occurs during this historical period. And that is monarchs will greatly strengthen their control and further the centralization process that we began talking about in Historical Period 1. This will continue into the 18th century, except for in Great Britain and the Netherlands. The best example for this consolidation will be analyzed in detail in this presentation, and that is none other than Louis XIV in France and his partner in crime, Finance Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert. These two will set the model for the absolutism, enforcement, and emphasize the idea of divine right kings. So let's get into it. After the early and mid-17th century, states began to centralize more, under the models of France with Charles VI and Louis XI, the Spider King, and again Henry IV, Henry of Navarre. Spain also had examples, being that of Charles II, who was also Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and then obviously Philip II. And Sweden will give them a shout out too with their centralization that occurred under Gustavus Adolphus, the leader of the 30 Years' War endeavors. Centralizing included more efficient taxation procedures, taking power away from the nobility, possessing a large standing army, and of course to oversee all of this, a more efficient and much larger bureaucracy than in ages previous. A new political theory, one that was even more highly centralized than the new monarchs that we've learned about in Historical Period 1, began to form after Philip II. And this theory is known as absolutism. Under absolutism, monarchs were not subordinate to national assemblies or parliamentary bodies. These are characteristics. The nobility was also effectively brought into further submission and controlled by the crown. And then we also mentioned bureaucracies. Well, the bureaucracies that we mentioned that were created by those new monarchs to control the armies and taxation were composed of career officials appointed by and solely accountable and answerable to the king, not to any type of parliamentary body. So now that you know a few of the characteristics of absolutism, let's talk about where the power of sovereignty comes from. Well, it's a belief. And absolutism drew its belief that its authority was from that of God. This is the era that we know of as the divine right monarchies, the divine right of kings. And the belief in this divine right of kings provided the king with complete and unquestionable authority. So much like the power of the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, if you questioned the crown, you questioned God, and the consequences were pretty stiff. Now, early on, Philip II of Spain had the most control, had more control than any other European monarch before him. And he kind of became the model for the later kings, especially Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII, which will eventually lead to Cardinal Mazarin and Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV will go down in history as the quintessential absolute monarch. So where did absolutism and this idea come from? Well, the philosophy of absolutism originated and morphed into something of significance with the ideas of three men. First was Jean Bodin, and we talked about him during the Renaissance era. And, he was around about 1530 to 1596. And he was one of the first to provide a theoretical basis for absolute states. He lived and wrote during the chaos of the French civil wars of the late 16th century, like the War of the Three Henrys that we covered in class, and he believed that only absolutism could provide order and force people to obey the government. In other words, the only way for a stable economy and society to take place was to actually strip people's individual freedoms away from them and force them to submit to a higher authority. And again, remember the era that he wrote this was very, very chaotic. The second philosopher of note that you need to know on the AP exam and for this class was a philosopher and proponent of the absolute style of governing, and this guy was Thomas Hobbes. And he wrote a book called The Leviathan in 1651. And yes, you need to know Hobbes and Leviathan. And he felt, too, that too much freedom prevented stability. He articulated a very, very pessimistic view of human beings in what he called his state of nature, state of humanity. And he felt that men were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, animalistic, and short and strong. And basically, he believed that when people have too much freedom, they act like animals. Anarchy results from chaos. So he believes that the central drive in every person is egotistically power. And he stated that political sovereignty is derived from people who transfer it to the monarchy by implicit contract. He justified the absolute monarchy, but we don't want to associate him with the divine right of kings. Again, his ideas became mostly closely identified with Voltaire in the 18th century, and something that we'll learn about, and that is later in this particular unit, enlightened despotism. So you need to note that Hobbes' ideas, they weren't really popular in the 17th century. However, they're going to be regurgitated, if you will, in the 18th century. Now, coincidentally, by the 18th century, too, there are new constitutional theories and ideas, and those constitutional people will believe that Hobbes is too authoritarian. Again, one of those constitutional men was John Locke. Stay tuned. The third gentleman that we need to know is Bishop Jacques Bossuet, and he was the principal advocate of divine right kings in France during the reign of Louis XIV, and he kind of justifies what Louis is doing procedurally, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but he believed that divine right meant that the king was placed on the throne by God and therefore owed his authority to no man or to no group. Now again, you got to think of the context of when these gentlemen are writing, and people are really buying what they are selling, especially the monarchs. So we've talked a little bit about absolutism when we talked about the Civil War. So what we need to do is just review briefly James I of England, the Stuart king that brought the Stuart line to England after the death of Queen Elizabeth Tudor. Again, he is one who admired Philip II and kind of modeled some of the things that he tried to do and establish in England. James I believed dearly in the divine right in kings and thought others should accept his laws and policies without question. England kind of tolerated him initially, and obviously they've had enough of him by the time his son takes the throne, and of course I'm talking about Charles I. But a story I remember reading long ago, on his way to a coronation of James I, there was some commotion, and here police officers, or soldiers I guess I should say, arrested a pickpocket. And James I, kind of ignoring English law, ordered him killed on the spot. And it kind of set the tone for his rule because, again, it's a coronation party. And I think if I remember correctly, the act was carried out. The man was killed. But, again, it wasn't congruent with actual English law. Now, how was James I absolute? Well, when Parliament refused to pay him overly large share of taxes, he acted as an absolute monarch by disbanding them. Again, that's going to be something that his son continues, and again, of course, I'm talking about Charles I. And he also attempted from that point on to rule alone, obtaining funds by selling lands and titles to the highest bidders. So we've already covered that in England, but again, I just wanted to introduce that we've actually talked a little bit about this absolutism. It might be good to also, when we look at France, and we've got to understand the path that led to Louis XIV. So the origins of the French Revolution, the seeds were planted kind of during the 100 Years' War, in which England battled France. Both countries started to collect standing armies, and to fund those they needed taxation, and through that also we saw a bureaucracy grow, and we learned about that through Louis XI, the Spider King. You also had the king versus the lords, where the crown, or monarchs, or powerful lords started to accumulate titles and threaten for the monarchy, and that's what they tried to do. They tried to get rid of the nobility, the competitive nobility, in order to expand royal power. They took out heavy loans, again, increased taxes to pay for those, but they were buying things like gunpowder and things of that nature that the other members of the nobility could not purchase, and those were extreme advantages against the weaker nobility. So again, we see kings taking power continually away from the nobility. We also see the independence from Rome. When there was the Avignon papacy, we know that there was 2 popes. We call that the Great Schism, sometimes the Babylonian captivity. We saw France and Spain in the late 1400s and 1500s invade Italy. So the Pope is kind of removed from real power. And then the Pope also in 1516 gives Francis I the Concordat of Bologna, which stated that the Pope could collect all the income of the Catholic Church in France, but the king was confirmed in his right to tithe the clerics. So he could actually tax some of the clerics and restrict their right to appeal to Rome. So it gave the king a little bit more power over the clergy, but also the Concordat, this is the most important thing of this, confirmed the kings of France right to nominate appointments to the clergy in high positions in the French church, which became known as the Gallican Church. So it enabled the crown, by controlling its personnel, to decide who was to lead the church in France. And again, that made basically the most powerful person in France in terms of politics and religion the king. We also saw some instability continue into the 16th century, where they didn't take enough power away from the nobility or that of the late Valois monarchs. They were very, very weak. And if you remember the St. Bart's massacre in I believe it was 1572, Catherine de' Medici, who was acting as regent to Henry, again, I can't remember if it was Henry II or Henry III, but nonetheless, had to be Henry III, issued a massacre of the Huguenots to try to get rid of their power. If you remember, there were 3 factions. Henry Valois, you had Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot, who became Henry IV, and they also fought Henry, Duke of Guise, who was in charge of the militant Catholics. So that was all brought to a head when Henry IV assumed the crown and issued the Edict of Nantes, and gave a little bit of religious tolerance to the Huguenots, while himself taking up Catholicism and converting to Catholicism to spare France further instability. And again, we mentioned him as one of the first examples of a politique, a ruler who puts the people of his country and the stability of his country over that of his religious preferences.